Glaucus and Onesimus met in the morning as though nothing had happened, but there was a noticeable change in the bailiff's behavior. He treated the boy with a kind of frightened respect, and Onesimus rose when he liked and did what he pleased, and did not do what did not please him. In fact, he could have become very idle, had he not loved the spring work on the farm, the hunting for the ewes in the ditches, and the feeding of motherless lambs. There was no better place than the pastures on these warm April evenings when the flock wandered bleating toward the fold, and the daisies closed their petals and the sun went down over Laodicea. "What are you dreaming of, boy?" the shepherd would ask him as he stood gazing westward across the valley. But the boy would only laugh and pick up a lamb and fondle it in his arms. But before the lamb was well over, a slave rode up to the farm on horseback and announced that Philemon and Apphia were already drawing near and were expecting him by nightfall. Onesimus did not question the slave about Archippus, because within a few hours he would see for himself. Ever since he had heard that there was a real possibility of healing, he had started to hope, and hope had grown to certainty, and he had not realized till today how shattered he would be if the miracle had not taken place, not so much for Archippus's sake as for his own. If Archippus were still lame, then never, as long as he lived, would he get rid of those feelings of guilt that sometimes tormented him on dark winter nights when the wind howled round the farm and bowed the trees like the clawing hands of some demon. But tonight he would be freed of the consequences of his sin. Tonight Archippus would walk in, and the torment would be gone forever. He did little that day, and Glaucus, ordering round the other slaves, was almost fawning in his politeness and consideration of Onesimus. Too restless to settle to any real work, he wandered off towards the canyons to pick a bunch of spring flowers for Pascacia's apartment, for the child loved flowers and would be weary after her journey. It was his last hour of idle freedom. Tomorrow Philemon would set him to work in good earnest, and he would be glad of it. He was tired of doing just as he pleased, and then he remembered that this was freedom, just to do as you please for the rest of your life, and to call no man your master, and he began to wonder, for the first time in his life, how much he would really enjoy it. He turned at the foot of the canyon, as he always did, to watch the evening sun sink behind Hierapolis and bathe the walls and battlements in its last light. But as he did so, he noticed the small procession, headed by the carriage, climbing the hill toward the upper plain of Colossus. Onesimus sped home. He could wait no longer to see what had happened. Would Archippus spring out of the carriage, or would he run the last lap, racing the horses as he used to love to do on cool evenings? Perhaps tomorrow he would climb the canyons. Yet just now they were trundling rather wearily up towards the farm, and there was no eager figure racing ahead. Probably he was waiting to give them all a surprise. And then the carriage drew up, with the tired slaves toiling behind, and Glaucus the bailiff was bowing and scraping and rolling out pompous salutations. Philemon climbed out and lifted down his son, while Pascasia handed him his crutch. But there was no trace of disappointment on the boy's bright face as he greeted the assembled household. Pale with fatigue from the cramped hours in the carriage, he was smiling, and there was a look on his face that seemed like an expression of triumph. Onesimus turned and fled. He had supper with his mother that night. It was good to have her home, and she told him as much as she could about the morning they had spent with Paul. They had all gone out to Miletus, south of Ephesus, to meet the ship, and he came ashore and talked to them on the beach. Being a slave, she had stood at the back and had heard but little. Pascasia had never been on a beach before and had kept wandering off to find shells, and Nerissa had had hard work not to lose her. She did not really know what Paul had said. Something about some wolves, she thought, but it was all very beautiful, and they had all knelt down at the end, and he had blessed them. Most people had wept because with the dangers and persecutions he was facing, it was unlikely they would ever see him again. But Nerissa had not wept. To go to Christ and to rest forever in his home seemed to her the most wonderful thing that could happen to anyone. Her only fear was that her boy might not be there with her. She was tired and slept early, but Onesimus lay awake till the fourth watch, tossing and cursing to himself. He felt he had been cheated. The dark shadow of his guilt would rest upon him forever now, and he wondered what Irene would say if she knew. But she must never know. There would always be a corner of his heart he could not show her. There would never be perfect truth between them. For 3 days he managed to avoid meeting Archippus alone or speaking to him, except for an embarrassed greeting, and he would have been surprised if he had known how much pain he was causing his young master. But on the fourth morning he was told to bring a sack of flour from the granary to the house, and bowed under the weight of it. He lurched round the corner, not seeing where he was going. "Stop, Onesimus! I can't get out of the way!" Archippus stood in the path, leaning heavily on his crutch, but he had called out too late. The top-heavy sack lunged forward and Onesimus with it, and Archippus went flying. The sack fell on the ground, and the slave stood stock still, aghast, waiting for an explosion of rage. But it never came. Archippus's face was twisted with pain, but he recovered himself quickly and held out his hand. "Please help me up, Onesimus," he said quietly. "It's a good thing I fell on that heap of straw. Hand me my crutch. It's all right. You need not look so frightened. It was not your fault, and I am not really hurt." Onesimus gaped at him, standing there pale and shaken from his fall, but completely in control of himself, and a sudden flood of compassion, remorse, and admiration welled up in his heart. He was so overcome that he sat down on the flour sack and stared at Archippus as though he had never seen him before in his life. "Master," he said slowly, his embarrassment forgotten, "I am really sorry you were not healed. What happened? I suppose all those miracles people talked about were just fakes." Archippus lowered himself beside him with some difficulty, his pain forgotten. He had so longed for this moment, but now that it had come, he felt unable to explain. Besides, sitting on a flour sack in the public courtyard was hardly the setting he had imagined. How could he make Onesimus see what he had seen? How could an unenlightened heart understand? How ridiculous it would sound! His slave would probably end up by despising him more than ever. No, they were not fakes. They were all true, and far more than we ever heard about. He hesitated, and then plunged boldly on. Paul talked to us at the seashore. He talked about the ministry he had received of the Lord Jesus and about caring for the church. He called it the flock of God. "Never mind about the church, master," interrupted Onesimus. "They'll be out to look for this sack of flour. Tell me about the miracle, or rather the lack of it." "I went forward and spoke to Paul when it was over," went on Archippus steadily. "We walked along the beach a little way, and we sat on a rock and talked. I asked him to lay his hands on me and heal me, so that I could go with my father and master Epaphras and preach the gospel all over Phrygia. But he said that he did not think that was the ministry God had given me. He thought I was meant to stay and tend the church here in Colossus, like a shepherd feeds the sheep and guards them from wolves without, and I did not need to walk far for that. He said that the miracles were given as signs, but I did not need a sign. I must learn to walk by faith. And then he told me what had happened to him. Someone with a loud voice, inside the house, began heaping abuse upon slaves who went to sleep in granaries. Neither boy took the slightest notice. He has a sickness he seldom talks about, went on Archippus, and he is often in pain. 3 times he prayed for healing, and the 3rd time the Lord himself spoke to him. He said, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." And do you know, Onesimus, ever since then he has been glad about his illness and weakness. "Glad? Whatever for? You looked glad too, master, when you were lifted out of that carriage. You Christians are strange people. I just cannot understand you. Why were you glad that day when you came home as lame as you went?" "Because our weakness makes us lean so hard on his strength. Before I was lame I was so proud and strong. I thought I could do anything. Now I am lame, I know I can do nothing. My weakness leads me back and back to him, and I love him as a thirsty man loves the fountain, and a cold man loves the fire. Only you cannot understand till you love him." "And you are content?" "Not only content, I'm glad." There was a light in his master's eyes that Onesimus had never seen before. He still did not understand, but he knew that Archippus had grown to patient, disciplined manhood, and in spite of his lameness, Onesimus would never despise him again. For the first time in his life he gazed at him with respect. "May the curses of all the gods descend upon you, idle slave," shouted the cook, flinging open the door of the house suddenly and throwing a bone which caught Onesimus full on the air. "Am I to wait until—" Then he caught sight of the young master and retreated hastily, although no doubt he intended to finish his sentence in the kitchen. Onesimus rose, helped Archippus to his feet, shouldered the sack, and lurched ahead to get what he deserved from the cook. But Archippus struggled on over the rough ground till he found an outcrop of rock and sat down to rest. The spring sunshine warmed him. The golden faces of the dandelions smiled up at him. It seemed as though every bird in the canyon was singing to his happy heart. He looked out across the valley where his feet would never travel, to the mountains he would never climb, and he praised God. He had won at last. Through all the years when he had sought so hard to impress Onesimus with his physical strength and beauty, his power and importance, his slave had hated and despised him. Now, his pride of life broken, a weak cripple with nothing left with which to impress, he had won his slave's allegiance. Perhaps in time he might even win his friendship.